Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. As I mentioned in the introduction to my last episode with Rebecca Buxton on the ethics of the asylum process, I do want to spend a bit more time in the politics of the UK and Europe on the podcast, looking at how issues of race, national identity, immigration are happening within our political systems, and what danger there is of a sort of Trump moment here, in which liberal democratic institutions really corrode or unwind altogether. And that's what this episode is about. How does the UK political system work? What role have debates about immigration played in our politics for the last 10 or 20 years? And what are our reasons for feeling optimistic or pessimistic about us going down the American path? My guest today is Rob Ford, who I think will be familiar to a lot of British listeners. For American or international listeners, Rob is probably one of our main public sort of commentators on the minutiae of elections and political coalitions. He's got a pretty big following online and a Substack. He's kind of like, I was going to say he's like a British Nate Silver, but that's kind of insulting now because Nate Silver's gone off the deep end with a few different things. So maybe like a British Nate Silver if Nate didn't lose his mind. In terms of his professional background, Rob is a professor of political science at the University of Manchester, and he works in the areas of public opinion, electoral choice, and party politics. And his book Revolt on the Right, on the rise of the UK Independence Party, was named Political Book of the Year in 2015. So Rob's a real expert on all of this stuff, and it was great to have him on. I think the conversation pretty much explains itself, and we do try to provide something of an introduction to British politics for international listeners. So, yeah. As always, if you enjoy the show, please do consider supporting on Patreon. I'm very grateful for some increased support there. I don't do any advertisements or commercial sponsorships on this show, so you're just listening to the episode without me interrupting it to sell you a VPN or something like that. What makes that possible is some of the audience chipping in. So if these episodes are enjoyable or interesting or valuable to you, I've been suggesting the price of a cup of coffee an episode. Actually, less now. A cup of coffee is more than my $2 an episode suggested. So for the price of half a cup of coffee, consider supporting the show. And you can do that at patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, or just follow the links on the website politicalphilosophypodcast.com, which has all the rest of the links there as well. So big thank you to everyone who does support, and if you listen and you're able to, please do consider doing that. Okay, let's get straight to it then. This is the UK immigration debate with Rob Ford. I am joined today by Professor Rob Ford. Rob, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, I'm back in the UK now, but as I mentioned, I spent quite a lot of time in the States, and a lot of my audience will be American. For them, and it's a weird question because I've been asked to do this a bunch of times and I don't have a great 1-minute response. Can we explain the UK political electoral system, say in contrast to the States, in the simplest possible terms?
Sure. I think the simplest way to explain it in a line would be It's the House of Representatives, but no Senate and no presidency. So all of the decisions are made by the House of Commons, which is elected by district, first past the post. So similar to the House of Representatives. So that's the institutional structure. And then the other big difference is, the US has two very big, very broad parties that soak everything up because they're quite porous. And we don't. We have a number of different parties. We have two parties that traditionally get to run the show, which is Labour and the Conservatives. But between them, they don't get 95% of the vote like the Republicans and Democrats get. They get more like 60%, 70% of the vote. So there's significant slices of votes going to other smaller parties. So you've got a Green Party, which for US audiences would be kind of like if Bernie Sanders had a party, that would be the British Greens are kind of like that. You've got the Scottish Nationalist Party, who, their name kind of gives it away. You've got the Liberal Democrats, who are kind of like, if sort of New England Republicans had a party, then maybe that would be the Liberal Democrats.
Liberal Democrats are so weird and hard to describe to a foreign audience. There isn't an analogue,
No, I mean, right now they're kind of like the Labour Party for the south of England in a way. But that's why I went for a regional analogue. And then you've got Reform UK, which is Nigel Farage's guy, which is our kind of Trumpy party, but it's not the dominant party in the right like the Trump Republicans are. It's a sort of splinter party that has a big vote but very few seats. So that's the system in a nutshell. So at the voter level, you've got votes split up to 5 or 6 ways. At the Westminster level, most of the seats go to the biggest two parties because they tend to be the ones that come in a first or second, more or less everywhere, and that's what the electoral system rewards, which is what makes it different to Europe, where you have a proportional system and all those parties get a significant representation in Parliament. We're a bit more like America in terms of two parties dominating the Parliament, but a bit more like Europe in terms of the vote actually splitting across multiple directions.
And when people ask if that sort of crazy hodgepodge works, the answer is, well, no, of course not. But it's what we have. I like that it's just the US House, because we think about the Prime Minister as kind of an analogue to the President, and in some ways they are, but in terms of like formal roles, they're actually the Speaker of the House. Our Senate is the House of Lords, and then the President is the King. But obviously the upper chamber and the sovereign have kind of just faded away in our system. Now it's just the lower house in terms of origins.
Exactly, which is why it's always a bit ironic when the British media in particular tends to talk about the presidentialization of politics. That's been a theme since the 1960s. And what they're talking about is, the Prime Minister becoming the most prominent figure and spokesperson in the media. But in an institutional sense, it's exactly the opposite. A presidentialization of our politics would mean our Prime Minister becoming less powerful. Because in our system, if you're the Prime Minister and you have a majority in the House of Commons, you can do what you like literally. There's not even constitutional checks of the forms that are familiar to the United States. We don't have a written constitution in Britain in the same way as the US does. We don't have a second house that can reject legislation particularly. They can slow it down, but they can't reject it. Our king formally signs off on everything, but hasn't actually rejected a bill for several hundred years. So what the Prime Minister says goes. I mean, it's the kind of level of concentration of power that a president would dream of, really. And it's the standard operating system in our country.
So in terms of UK politics, let me give you a narrative and you respond. Tell me if you think it, obviously very simplified, but if it's broadly accurate, that for about a decade now, our politics has centred concerns about immigration purportedly being too high. There were many things that went into Brexit, but probably the single biggest was concerns about immigration. Why, for instance, we had to have a so-called harder Brexit as opposed to a softer one was about freedom of movement, i.e. immigration. And even through to today, it seems like Starmer has accepted this premise that the main problem to be, or at least a big problem to be solved in the country, is securing the borders and stopping people coming in. Now, none of that's worked. Brexit has not delivered on the promises that were made of it. even quite narrowly on the promises to reduce immigration levels. And we've made the country a lot worse off chasing that as a goal because the Liberal enemy says it's the wrong goal. Like, the point is to make the country happy and healthy and prosperous, not how many people cross the border. But nonetheless, that has been the sort of the carrot on a stick, or the force pulling us forward for the last decade. What do you make of that narrative?
I think there's a lot in it. I think I would make two amendments to it. Well, an amendment and an expansion. The first is I'd extend the timeline. So I think the primacy of immigration, if you look, for example, if you simply ask people, what are the most important issues on the agenda? It's one of the questions pollsters ask an awful lot in this country. So you've got a really long time series. You can see immigration rising to the top of the list, top three, in the early 2000s, and staying there pretty much all the way through to the immediate aftermath of Brexit, when Brexit takes over. So in that sense, it's a 20-year story. But I think the way I would expand upon that is, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about immigration in a political sense? What is it that voters are agitated about when they say immigration is a concern of theirs? Because there's a really important asymmetry here. It is not the case that the vast majority of voters are anti-immigration instinctively. That actually did used to be the case. If you go back to the politics of the 1960s in Britain, you're talking like 80-90% anti-immigration, on principle. It's more even divide now, but there's a really big asymmetry, which is that the half of the public that really doesn't like immigration is very mobilized by it, very agitated by it. That becomes the primary political problem for them. Whereas the half that's broadly pro, they think, like, as you put it, this isn't the problem we care about. We care about the country being prosperous. We care about the public services. This is a non-issue. So for one side, it's a dominant issue, and for the other side, it's a non-issue, which creates a kind of asymmetry. Even though the overall balance of opinion is more even, the balance of politically mobilized concern is all on one side. But then what is it? What is the nature of that concern? And one aspect of it, I think, is why it fed into Brexit, which is the public believes, and I think this is true in most countries, that one of the central jobs of a national government is controlling the border, controlling who gets to come in, who gets to stay, and on what terms. And so they never bought in to the central organizing principle of freedom of movement within the EU, which is that you can't control who comes in and on what terms from this large geographical unit, because the sovereignty on that is pooled. Now, that wasn't an issue in the early decades of Britain's membership of the EU, because although there actually was quite a lot of EU immigration in numerical terms, it wasn't really very visible. I mean, I should declare an interest here. I'm the child of an EU immigrant. My mum arrived in the 70s. No one was particularly bothered about Dutch people coming to work in the NHS at that point. But after 2004, when the Central European post-communist countries came in, there was a very, very large and very, very rapid increase in EU immigration from those countries, and it went everywhere. So large parts of the country that had never really wandered down the high street and heard people speaking a different language, they'd never seen shops selling unfamiliar products, all this kind of thing. All of this started to happen in places that had never had any experience of it before. And once they started to think about it or look into it, what they would realize is that this was a form of immigration that the government was not controlling and could not control. And then when they started getting agitated about it, you could see that at a sort of deep level, politicians recognized that this was a problem, because they wouldn't stand up for freedom of movement and explicitly make the case for it. They just kept promising that they would control some forms of immigration without ever saying out loud, but this form of immigration that you're currently concerned about, we can't control it. Which I think their silence on that reveals that they realized they didn't have a strong positive argument to make that would land with the public. That then feeds into Brexit, because that provides the fuel for Nigel Farage and the radical right. And their argument is, well, if you want to control immigration, you need to leave the EU. Now, Farage himself has said that the A8 accession was the biggest gift to his politics imaginable, because before the A8 and before EU expansion, it was really hard to get voters to think about immigration as being an issue to do with the EU. They didn't think of these things as related to each other. After that, they could see the link intuitively. And so that meant he could channel this concern about immigration control into his desired institutional reform. So that gets us to Brexit. Then post-Brexit, the politics of immigration changes again, because now we do have national control over immigration. But two other things change. Firstly, Brexit gifts us two deep tribal political identities, Leave and Remain, which become really important political forces in themselves. And Leavers become the ones who are very, very focused on immigration control, and Remainers become people who regard this as part of the big mistake of Brexit. But the other thing is that the first post-Brexit governments decide to exercise their new sovereignty over immigration by actually increasing immigration from outside the EU. In the years immediately following COVID, very, very high levels. So in this period, you actually see all the years before Brexit, you have like really high concern about immigration year in, year out. Immediately after Brexit, it falls off the agenda. Everyone's focused on the debate about how do we leave the EU. Immigration continues to be high, incidentally, in this period, but people aren't focused on it. Then, after the Brexit deal is done in 2021, immigration shoots back up again, and concern about it follows about a year later, once all the statistics start coming out. So, to condense that story down into a nutshell, at no point in the past 20 years has concern about immigration really been a story that's just about immigration. It's because immigration sucks in deeper concerns about sovereignty, concerns about national identity, concerns about the border and how to control things, and clashing partisan political identities as well. So there's always a lot more going on when we're talking about immigration than just immigration.
I want to pick up on two sides of what you just said. I'll say a little piece on either of them, and then feel free to build off either or. The first is the disparity. The people who care about immigration on the anti-side care about it a lot. The people who are pro-immigration, it's like 7 on their list of things, I think that helps to explain a seeming paradox in British politics, which is actually, you'd think, looking at the outputs of our politics, that anti-immigrant feelings are increasing, and they're not. They're actually falling. Like, the number of people who have a positive perception of immigrants is rising, particularly among young people. So, and yet our politics seems to be becoming more and more defined by who can best keep immigrants out. And the answer is, if you're a politician, the people who really care about it on the anti-side, you're going to get a lot of support for being the most rabid anti-immigrant person in the room. You're not really going to get people cheering and waving the flag for being pro-immigrant. So politicians aren't, even if that would be the numerical majority. The other point I'll just note is I think you're exactly right that a lot of it's about the visibility of immigration. I think, and we can get on to the current Labour government, there's a feeling of maybe if we fiddle with the knobs and have this sort of visa, it'll satisfy people and calm them down. I really remember I used to live in Carlisle, which is 99% white. There are no immigrants there, really. And this older woman telling me, I hate walking down Botchergate, it's like being in the Middle East. And there's one Arabic shop there. That's it. But that was the concern. I can see something that's visibly foreign, and not like French, like Syrian or something. And I don't want that. And it does seem to me that if that's what you're chasing, and I think that is the core, the centre of the anti-immigrant animus, what would satisfy that? If Carlisle is too diverse for you, there's not a fine-tuning of the visas that's going to satisfy that woman. But yeah, feel free to take me up on either side of that.
Yeah, I'm going to say a little bit on both, actually. So on the first point, I think you're exactly right. There has never been and continues not to be a strong strategic incentive for the liberal or pro-migration sides to campaign on immigration, because there aren't votes in it, simply. Parties are vote maximising outfits. The kinds of voters that are pro-immigration will back these parties for other reasons, and this is not a deal breaker for them. So you focus your attention elsewhere. So all the noise comes on the anti-immigration side. But something else that has changed in the last 20 years, which explains that paradox of we've become more liberal in the structure of attitudes on average, yet it feels like we've become more anti-immigration, is because the anti-immigration side has become even more mobilized over time in recent years. This issue has become even more salient for them. So we currently have a polling environment in Britain where about a quarter of the public say they back the Labour Party, it's the government at the moment, about a quarter say they back the traditional Conservative opposition, and a quarter say they back Reform. And the Reform quarter, if you ask what's the most important issue to them, 80 to 85% of them say immigration. So they have become wholly focused on this one issue as a kind of existential issue for them. And so that's a degree of amplification that wasn't even true 10, 15, 20 years ago. The Conservative voters of then would have been, it would have been higher up the list, but it would have been one of a family of things. Now it's become the thing. So that asymmetry has grown over time, I think. And then on the point about visibility, I think the important thing to remember here is that the sort of if we slice the electorate in half and say half of it's migration indifferent rather than necessarily positive, and half of it's migration skeptical, the migration skeptical half it's a diverse group as well. So there's a slice of it where visibility is at the heart of this, and that's often a story about identity and difference and culture and threat. And the darker end of that story gets into racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and so on. And, in earlier phases of British history, that was the dominant story. Some of the earliest polling on immigration asked people during the post-war years when we were receiving immigration essentially from two sources, Ireland and the Caribbean, so the 1950s, early 1960s. And they did one of the earliest survey experiments I know about, where they asked half the sample about the Irish and half the same question about Caribbeans, whether or not this was a positive or negative. And the negativity towards Caribbeans, who were a smaller incoming group at that point, was miles higher. So there was a clear racial element to it then. That's much less clear in the data these days in terms of the overall sources of this. But there is clearly a slice of the electorate for whom this is the story. The country's changing, it's visibly changing, it's culturally changing, and that's not change that I like. The second part of that story is that visibility can be direct experience on a high street, as you mentioned, but it can also be visibility in terms of the stories that are circulating politically.
Yeah.
And these days that can be both media and social media. And that kind of visibility in the current moment in British politics, it tends to sort of zoom in on very particular kinds of immigrants. So, I work in a university. Student migration is actually a huge part of the aggregate figures. They don't feature in these kinds of stories. Whereas migrants coming across the English Channel from France to claim asylum is a really small share of the overall migration statistics, but a huge share of the media debate about immigration, the political debate about immigration, the social media debate about immigration. And that is in part because that's where the migration story butts up against the control of our borders, choosing who comes here and on what terms story. So it's the symbolic resonance that produces some of that salience, I think. It is people kind of coming here in a way that looks like it's jumping the queue, breaking the laws and so on, and people get very agitated about that. But that produces one of the biggest problems in the kind of public policy side of immigration. The lever you can pull is the lever about what sort of visas people get. But that lever isn't the lever people want you to pull. You can pull that lever and reduce the number of people who can come here to work, reduce the number of people who come here to study. Those are not the visible people. Those are not the people that your voter in Carlisle is noticing, nor are they the people that are seeing on the news.
She doesn't want the store that sells harissa. That's what she wants gone. Yeah. And that's already there. Like the people who own that are probably British citizens.
Exactly. So you can't. There's no lever you can pull that addresses her concern, nor is there really a lever.
Unless we're going to get much more authoritarian than even the likes of Farage are proposing.
But that's the problem, is that the lever that would work on that is actually a lever that the vast majority of the public wouldn't want to go near. So when politicians say they want to increase...
Although I am somewhat disturbed by the polling we had on racially immigratory motivated riots at the beginning of the year, in which something like a third of the public said they supported setting fire to hotels with immigrants in them. That was a bit of a dark polling.
I haven't seen... I would be surprised if the figure was as high as a third.
It was in the 30s of approval for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an old sort of adage in polling. If a finding looks really surprising to you, and you know polling, it's probably
an outlier.
The question. I would be very surprised. I wouldn't be surprised by 10% or 15%, which is obviously still concerning, but a third would surprise me a lot. Maybe it was a third of Reform supporters, for example, rather than the general public.
No, I think it was general, but nonetheless, I mean, I merely say that to say there is a section of the British electorate who, I think there's two groups. One who doesn't like the store that sells harissa and doesn't know what to do about it, and one who doesn't like the store that sells harissa and actually would back something very authoritarian.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's also a third group that aren't primarily motivated by the store that sells harissa, but by the people they see arriving on the beach on the news, which they see as different to the harissa store issue.
Yeah, for sure. But of the visibility people, I think there's sort of two paths there. Anyway, go on.
Well, I think on the whole, the market for deportation, mass deportation, is a very minority market. I think this is one of the things that, because we've seen Elon Musk sort of stirring the pot in our politics a lot recently, and he's clearly a fan of what amount to aggressive moves to reverse cultural change, which could include mass deportation. But there's a reason that our most prominent radical right politician, Nigel Farage, has explicitly distanced himself from those kinds of approaches, which is that there isn't a big market for that in the public, because the national debate on who constitutes us and who constitutes them has moved on. If you take the polling from, say, the 1980s about who's a true British person, because this is the other element I think we need to get into when we're talking about the harissa shops. This is really a story about us and them. It's a story about identity, who belongs, who doesn't. And if you go back to the 80s, a majority of people would say, if you're not born here, you're not fully British. A majority would say, not a majority, but a substantial slice, maybe 30-40% would say, if you're not white, then you're not really as British as people who are white. The shares who would say that now are below 10%. The overwhelming majority of people say, Britishness is not a matter of race. Britishness is not a matter of being born here or having ancestors here. And there's plenty of reason to think that they mean what they say, because an objection that can always be made to that is, that's just cheap talk. People are just saying what they think people want to hear. But two examples. One, intermarriage rates across racial lines have shot up in this country. The largest and the most rapidly growing ethnic minority group in Britain, and the largest amongst the under 10s, is people with mixed heritage. Now, those people are not faking it in terms of, I don't mind whether people are a different ethnicity, because they're kind of acting on that kind of belief in the most fundamental way they could. And then in politics, for a long time, we've been able to get evidence indirectly on people's racial biases. Would they be willing to elect a black MP, an Asian MP, and so on? In particular, if you have a white MP replaced by a non-white MP, you can see whether there's changes in the patterns of vote that would suggest maybe people weren't willing to vote for the non-white MP. And there is an effect. I mean, it's not that Britain is free of racial bias, but the effect is much, much smaller than it used to be. So this is not a racially egalitarian country. This is still a country that's scarred by race. This is still a country where there are people who think about identity in terms of heritage and would like to turn the clock back. But those people are a small and declining minority of the electorate. That is not the dominant view. Even amongst the sort of migration skeptical half of the electorate, that is not the dominant view.
What possibility do you see of that reversing, though? because one thing that's alarmed many of us American politics watchers is there's been a long-standing debate on the US. Obviously, the immigration is structured very differently, but one point of contention for a very long time now is there's something like 13 million people, maybe as high as, actually don't even cite me on a figure. There's a very large population of people who are not in the United States legally, and it gets called undocumented. What do we do about that? The most radical answer is deport all of them. But I think everyone understands, or has historically, that's just not a feasible or fair. A lot of these people are married to American citizens, have children who are American citizens, like deport 20 million people. Now, that's what Trump ran on in 2016, but polling shows even his base kind of didn't buy that. They sort of thought, well, he's staking out a rhetorically maximalist position, but what he'll really do is just be more conservative of immigration relative to the status quo. That was how people interpreted that. Now, that changed in the last election, and support for mass deportation went from, the kind of numbers we're talking about, like somewhere in the 10 to 30% sort of range, to now it's a majority proposition. Now it's 50, 60%. And that, for a lot of us, that really just came out of nowhere. Like, why did 30% of the electorate swing on this? Now, if you break it down to, like, exactly what they're visualizing when they think about that, it gets a bit more finicky. Like, would you support deporting someone who has American citizens as children, right? But nonetheless, it was a sharp jump, like a really sharp jump for a policy that has traditionally been understood to be well outside of, like, what's normally talked about in politics. I mean, should we, in the story of, like, because they are, the number of overt racists, the number of people who are very concerned about immigration for sort of, let's say, cultural identitarian reasons is declining in the UK. But the tide internationally seems, as you mentioned, Musk seems to be going the other way. How surprised would you be if we had, like, a reversal like that in the UK?
This is a great question, because I think it touches on lots and lots of things. And what I'm going to try and do is tell what I think is a positive story about the direction of travel on this, which is, I think, the positive story that frames your expectations, frames why you're surprised. I would also be surprised by such a reversal. Then I'm going to tell a more negative story, a more worrying story about how these things can go. And then I'm just going to conclude with, like, well, could that happen in Britain? I think that's a nice way to end it. So the positive story is a story of structural change, essentially. It's a story of rising numbers of graduates, rising number of people who have themselves migrant heritage, rising generational change towards more socially liberal values. These are all changes that social scientists have been charting for decades. We are becoming a more highly educated, more socially liberal, more culturally diverse society. And if you look at the generational structure of attitudes on more or less anything that has a social dimension to it or an identity dimension to it, you'll find that the older generations are more restrictive and conservative, and the younger generations are more liberal. So the direction of long-term travel would seem to be always in that on that trajectory. So therefore, maybe we shouldn't worry. But then what happens in the US? And I think that points to a second story, which I think is important in a way that political parties often don't appreciate, which is social norms are also tremendously important drivers of attitudes and behavior. A colleague of mine, Vincenzi Valentims, just recently published an excellent book on this, looking at how the radical right in Spain gradually eroded norms sanctioning open expressions of racism. So if we believe that our peers and fellow citizens regard certain kinds of attitudes and behaviors as unacceptable and will sanction us for expressing those behaviors or supporting those causes, then we will police our own behavior. We will often internalize these norms. We will say, this is what a good person looks like. Look at what's happened over the debate with regards Musk's salute. You've got US media outlets calling it a straight-armed gesture, whereas the German press say a Hitler salute is a Hitler salute is a Hitler salute. There's a difference between a norm that's eroding and a norm that's still firm. You know, on one side you've got a red line and he's crossed it. On the other side you've got grey area. That's a norm being eroded right there in real time. It's really troubling. And what's really troubling about it is because what you see in the US in the past few years is exactly that. You see the fragility of social norms, that if they come under sustained attack from a section of the political spectrum that has strong structural support, strong support in the electorate, strong media presence and so on, then those norms can be eroded, because those norms are themselves about an interpersonal judgment. I feel this behavior is unacceptable because I think everyone else thinks it's unacceptable. If you start to get signals that say, no, maybe it isn't, then you start to question, you know, your adherence to the norm. So that is what I think has been happening in America and would account for something like what you're seeing on the illegals migration. Then on the could it happen here in Britain? I think the first point is that the resource that Trump has to erode these kinds of norms, Trump and Musk has, is very strong partisanship. US partisanship is a real outlier compared to, say, European countries. The share of people who feel that their political identity is a big part of who they are is really high in America, and that kind of influences everything.
No one does here.
Well, exactly. It's much less.
Not as many, you know.
I mean, not as many by a literal order of magnitude. You're going from like 80% of people thinking that's more like 15-20%. Brexit illustrated how that could be different, and the tone and character of the debates over Brexit were different, in part because they became debates about who people were and what they valued, because they'd internalized this sense of identity. So it can change, but as things stand, a politician in Britain wouldn't be able to draw on that level of resource in terms of telling people that thing that you thought was wrong actually isn't wrong. Because on the whole, people would say, no, it is wrong and you're wrong. Whereas in America, you've got the power to sway people more, perhaps. And I think the other point to make on this is illegal immigrants are the most vulnerable group of all. I mean, what was it that Bentham used to say about, you know, you can tell a lot about society by how it treats its prisoners. I think in contemporary society that you could make the same point with regards illegal immigrants, because they are the people who are least covered by all of people's assumptions about norms of fair and equal treatment, because they've got the word illegal attached to them. It's like a mark of Cain. They came here, they broke the law, they're not welcome, they didn't follow the rules. So they are always the most vulnerable group. So I think, in a way, to mix my metaphors, they're like the canary in the coal mine. If a norm in terms of treating people with a basic level of decency is eroding, they'll be the first group that gets hit by that. And that's what we're seeing in the US. So I think if it were to happen in Britain, then it would probably happen in the same way, in terms of it would be illegal immigrants who get hit by this first. But I think it's probably a harder boulder to push up the hill here, because you don't have that resource of extreme partisanship that you have in the US.
I think that's right. I'd add another element to the disanalogy, which would be the norm erosion in the US isn't just like Trump got up and said this one day. It's structural. The most racist vote in the US, which is a sort of legacy of Jim Crow and so on, what sometimes gets called a white Southern identity, which is an interlinked set of commitments around race, gender, and religion, that for the latter half of the 20th century, particularly through, say, the Reagan and Clinton eras, was split between the two main parties. Historically, that vote was always Democratic, going back to Lincoln being a Republican. After the Civil Rights era, it became much more contested between the parties. Now, what that produced is the politics of dog whistles. You have to market yourself to both racists and anti-racists. So you say things like states' rights and welfare queens and so on and so forth, right? It also gave us a very, politics of civility and bipartisanship. What happened through the Obama era, really, is that transformation completed itself. Now, anyone who's motivated by racism is in the Republican Party. Anyone for whom it's an absolute deal breaker is in the Democratic Party. And when Trump says they're all rapists or something, you'd expect there to be a reaction. You'd expect it to lose in votes, but it doesn't, because that realignment is completed. There isn't that story
in the US, in the UK. You know, in the US, we've had this very strange realignment around race that has obfuscated just how large the racist vote in America still is. And now that that vote is now that social identity is now directly lined up with partisan identity, we're all surprised by how strong it is. That's never happened in the UK. The parties have never switched with regards to this. You know, they've ebbed and flowed, and you know, maybe, you know, Starmer and Blair or whatever have made their compromises, certainly around these sorts of issues, but they've never flipped. So, you know,
I would extend the analogy further in another direction.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You put your finger on it. And indeed, one of the mistakes that gets made most frequently, in my view, in British politics is to extend analogies with American politics too far, because they miss really basic disanalogies like this. I like that word, by the way. I'm going to use that more often. So the other thing about the US situation, aside from the partisan realignment story, which is really important, is within living memory, the US South had a political system that was built around the explicit exclusion of people from political and social rights on the basis of race. The America that Obama himself was born into was one in which, if his parents had met in Virginia, they would not be allowed to marry, and his father would not be allowed to vote if he'd been born in America, which he wasn't. But there is no analog for that whatsoever. No, I mean, you know, people can talk about the British Empire being racist, and of course, there's a story to tell about that, which is absolutely true. But on domestic British territory, there was never any law that excluded people from participation in the political system on the basis of race. Never any law that segregated people on the basis of race. Never any law that prevents people from marrying across racial lines. No such thing ever existed. Indeed, the story of post-war immigration was a story of people arriving with full political and social rights from the day they arrived as Commonwealth citizens. Their story is a story of incredibly illiberal rules written into the legal and political system. Our story is in terms of the legal and institutional side, the exact opposite of that. Our immigrants, actually, this sets us apart from the rest of Europe. Immigrants arriving here from South Asia and the Caribbean could vote from the very first general election after they arrived. They come here, they register at the British address, they had full voting rights straight away. Compare that to the Turkish population of Gastarbeiter in Germany, where you could be second or third generation German and still had no political rights. It's a huge difference. And the US situation, you had a huge American for sort of 5-10 generations or more population in Georgia and Florida and Alabama and so on, and all of them were completely disenfranchised, completely excluded from the political system. So that is, as you say, one of the really deep taproots of the Trump phenomenon, which doesn't have an analogy in the British context.
It doesn't, and one thing I've been really big on in just to sort of cite myself in my public writing is the line between the sort of civil rights era and Trump it's not some weird long bendy road. There's just a very clear continuity. Obviously, it's different and expressed in different language now, but it's not. You know, Trump was born into that era. You know.
Yes. Exactly.
Now, here's what I imagine a lot of people will say, and to a degree, I would say, are we as Brits patting ourselves on the back a bit much here? Like, yeah, we never had all of that. We still had a frickin' empire, like, which certainly involved a lot of racism and oppression and so on, and that only really got dismantled in the 50s and 60s, and vestiges of it remain today. I think, and you know, just anecdotally, as someone in an interracial marriage, I will tell you, people in this country can be racist. Even people who would not answer the survey questions we've been talking about, and people who vote Labour, and like, once you've sort of seen it from the other side, like, no, people can be quite racist, you know? Obviously, that's anecdotal, but still. And then to maybe put a bit more of like a structuralist argument behind it, you could say, in the age of social media and the internet being where people get most of their news from, increasingly everything is getting subsumed into this American-led and American-defined culture war. And you can see that in the Tory leadership picking up talking points from the American right that don't make any sense in the British context, but they're doing it. And that, where Brexit and Trump came from in terms of the historical path in are just very different trajectories. But where the sides are now is increasingly a story of convergence. And increasingly, mainline liberalism and sort of one nation Toryism, they have that adherence, but they both feel like creeds that are no longer making new converts. The shape of things to come is the two sides of the American culture war. And are we here going to just be, especially because we're English language speaking and quite culturally similar to the US in terms of we watch the same TV shows and stuff, going forward, are we going to be subsumed into that, which will mean our political right becomes much more radical and the half of the spectrum who follow them go with them? That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. On the first point, I completely agree, and I think this is in part it's almost a language point. So recently I read Not the End of the World by Hannah Ritchie, who's one of the more in data, the world in data people. And in the preface to the book, she said, I could put the following caveat on every single page: things are getting better, but they're still bad. I don't do this because it's just bad writing style and you'll get bored of it, but it's always true. So the point is that if you're trying to make an argument in a compact way in terms of this is the difference between Britain and America, you can say this is a thing that's better in Britain and really bad in America. We never had legally sanctioned segregation. We never had Jim Crow. We never had laws banning intermarriage. We never politically excluded the group. That does not mean we are good. It just means we are less bad. The problem is when we do these comparisons, language and brevity constrain us to binaries. But what we're talking about is points on a scale. It's not that the Brits are angels and the Americans are devils. It's that the Americans are 2 out of 10 on this scale, and we're 4 out of 10 on this scale. 4 out of 10 is not great, but it's better than 2 out of 10. So that's what I think it's important to caveat that. And the problem is whenever you have that discussion, unless you then extend it out 3 paragraphs, that you end up with that objection, and it's completely fair. But and actually, to be honest, when I've tried to make these points, this is always the first response I get, and it's tricky because you want to say, look, we are better than we were in the past. We're still bad. We haven't made some of the mistakes the Americans have made, but we've made mistakes of our own. But I think it's important not to lose the optimistic point as well. So we've just lived through a general election in Britain in which the first ever ethnic minority prime minister stood for re-election, and it was a complete non-issue. Even with our radical right at 15 to 20% in the polls, it was a non-issue. I genuinely and honestly believe if Rishi Sunak had been running as Prime Minister of the centre-right in Sweden or Germany or France, it would have been not just a issue, it would have been one of the issues in that election. And I think that is something important that we shouldn't lose sight of about how we've changed as a country, because
European racism, also a real thing.
Very much so.
At it.
So if Rishi Sunak had been running as the heir to Margaret Thatcher in, say, 1987, it would have been a completely different story as well. So I think it is a way in which we have changed and in which we are somewhat distinctive. It does not by any means mean that Britain as a country is a country of angels. And then on your point about the direction of travel and the convergence, I think this is correct. And I think there's something really challenging for people in my sort of neck of the woods as political scientists, in that I think what we may be confronted with is a need to study a part of the political spectrum that often we neglect. So we're all very fond in my line of work of studying the centre-left, because a lot of the people in this line of work are centre-lefties to some extent, or the radical right, because they've always been a sort of interesting and disruptive and threatening phenomenon. But the real action is the centre-right. This brings me back to my points about norms and stuff like that as well. What you're describing, in a sense, what we've seen happen in the US in the past kind of 20 years is the collapse of the centre-right into the radical right, which kills the guardrails off. It kills the norms off.
Right.
The centre-right are a really important bulwark of a liberal democracy, and I think an underappreciated one. The centre-left don't appreciate them because they push against them. The radical right don't appreciate them because they regard them as sellouts and capitalists, Davos people and so on. But, the Christian democratic movements that built post-war German democracy, the Gaullist movement that built and Italian democracy, the Gaullist movement that built French democracy, these kinds of movements are really, really important for keeping people in a kind of socially conservative, yes, let's slow things down, yes, centre ground, a communitarian, yes, a form of conservatism that is about preservation, that is about stability, but isn't about reaction, it isn't about hostility, it isn't about the kinds of things that we're seeing with the radical right. And I think we have underestimated the importance of the steady erosion of that kind of politics. And that is a common theme. You see it in Britain, you see it in the US, you see it in Europe as well. Everyone, again, in my line of work, but also in the media, they're always talking about how can the centre-left deal with the radical right? I think the bigger question is, how does the centre-right deal with the radical right? Because if the centre-right collapses into the radical right, we're into a much more toxic political dynamic, full stop. So, yeah.
One thing you could get me started on, and we won't because we're at the end, is how we always assume it's liberals' responsibility to deal with the far right. Well, there's the word right in there. It's presumably, hopefully, also conservatives' responsibility, but that's not how we think about and tell that story.
Well, that was one of the interesting and I think neglected subplots to Brexit, is you saw that actually playing out on the British right. There were people who wanted to embrace this because they thought this was going to bring them a new electorate. It was going to take them to dominance. This is the sort of Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings worldview. Let's ride this tiger. But there were also people who were saying, this tiger will turn on us at some point and it'll eat us. This is not a force we should want to unleash as conservatives. A lot of the, I wouldn't say anti-Brexit, but the sort of soft Brexit or Brexit skeptic people on the right were saying, you should be wary of the forces you are helping to legitimate and to unleash by embracing this cause. And they were saying that from a conservative perspective. This is a form of disruption to our society that we should not want as conservatives. And I feel that that line of thinking, we need more of that. But as you say, it shouldn't be coming from liberals, because also we can't make that language, that argument in the language that makes sense to the people it needs to land with. I think people who are instinctively...
And we just don't have standing with them.
No, exactly. And we don't have standing. Yeah. So...
And you see that in the US from the Clinton era. The right was having that debate way before Trump, and I think has now been decisively lost by the centre right.
Yeah. So we as liberals should be worried about the lack of conservative thinkers making that kind of case. They should be our friendly enemies, as it were, because there's a common enemy here that's much more serious, which is the radical right. But I sometimes we've been keen to sort of crow about our triumphs on certain social issues over, moderate conservative, centre-right conservatives, and some of those are important fights to win, of course. But right now, the weakest guardrail is not on the left side; it's on the right side, I think.
Yeah, and that's the guardrail that I'm increasingly feeling like might fall in British politics, and we might get that much more pessimistic scenario that I outlined.
We could do a whole second podcast about the plight of the Conservative Party, actually. That's a whole nother story.
Come back on and do it. But on that optimistic note, let's pause it there. Do you want to just quickly tell listeners where to follow you or anywhere else you'd like to direct them to?
Yeah, sure. If you enjoyed this discussion and you'd like to hear more from me, I'm regularly on Blue Sky at Rob Ford Manx, and also the same handle on Twitter, although I'm not on there so often. And you can also find me. I have a Substack. It's called the Swingometer. It's been a bit quiet lately because I'm trying to finish a book, but that's where I post. Yeah.
Awesome, Rob. Thanks so much for your time today.
My pleasure.